So you might have heard of LLMs.txt. This is an emerging standard for providing guidance or links to LLM related to a website typically. So I'll open up LLM.txt for LangGraph docs. You can see it has a number of sections, it's a simple markdown file, and really what it's doing is it's giving a bunch of links to our docs along with descriptions about what each link covers. You can see this covers our how-to guides, conceptual docs, and use cases. Now the question is, how can I take this doc and use it with applications like Cursor, Windsurf? So we put together a really simple way to do that. First, I'll show you this working in Cursor, Claude Desktop, and Windsurf, and then we'll walk through exactly what's going on under the hood. I'm in Cursor right now, open up a fresh chat, select the agent, and I'll prompt it with a question about LangGraph and some basic instructions. I'm using Claude 3.7 Sonnet, and you can see that it's going to ask me to make some tool calls. First, it's going to run this list doc sources tool. This is going to return the LLM.txt file that I want the application to use. Then it's going to read that file. What's nice is when I set this up as a tool via MCP, I can actually see explicitly what is passed back to the LLM context. So that full LLM.txt file is passed. Now it reflects on this documentation and identifies the memory concept page as useful to answer my question. There it is. We can see it then wants to fetch this particular page. Perfect. It answers the question extremely well. And I can see very precisely what it's pulling back into context through these MCP tool calls. I'm in Windsurf, open up Cascade. You can see I have this MCP server connected. Here's the tools available. Go ahead and ask my question. And it successfully identifies the LLM.txt that I provided. It reflects on the contents of LLM.txt, and it goes and fetches a few individual web pages provided. In particular, this concepts memory page, and it answers my question very nicely. Claude Desktop, you can see those two tools via my MCP server are present. Ask the same question. Again, I'm going to allow Claude to make tool calls in this chat. It fetches the LLM.txt, it reads it. This is pretty cool. Based on the documentation, I can see there's a dedicated page related to memory. It reads that page. Perfect. That's exactly what I want. And look at this. It answers the question nicely based on the content of the memory documentation. Now that I've shown this in action, let me pull back a little bit and explain what's going on and why we did this. So one interesting point of confusion that I've seen quite a bit online is that it is true that IDEs like Cursor and Windsurf have support for loading documents. It works a bit differently in each case. So Cursor, when you use @docs, it will actually index docs for you. Windsurf @docs will actually search over the specified domain. Let's just see this in Cursor quickly. So I'm in Cursor settings. You can see there's this docs option. Let's go ahead and add a new doc. And I'll go ahead and pass the URL to my LLM.txt. Confirm. Now it's been added and we can see it's been indexed. Let's go to chat, open up a new chat, agent @docs. There's my doc. And I'll go ahead and add some instructions. Reflect on the URLs in this doc provided, directly read any URLs that are relevant to the question, use this to answer the question, and I provide my question here. So you can see the thinking process, it identified a bunch of URLs in the doc. That's great. I just want to load this directly, of course. Now this is what I found kind of interesting. In Cursor, it'll actually do web search, and I see no results found. Again, it searches the web again. And this is what's interesting. In this final web search, I've seen this before, it pulls a whole bunch of different URLs, but I can't actually see the context loaded from these URLs. So it's kind of opaque to me as the user. So if I generalize what's happening, basically I'm offloading the tool definition and usage to Cursor agent, which actually is fine in a lot of cases. I like Cursor a lot. I use it all the time, but I don't have much visibility into what this built-in tool is and the context it's returning, as well as the tool call it's making. It's a little bit opaque to me. And this was kind of the motivation for building the MCP server that we did. Now, before I talk about the server specifically, I do want to kind of mention a few different approaches generally for adding context to LLMs. So the first and most simple way to think about this is just stuffing. So taking documentation, stuffing it directly into the context window of an LLM. It's simple. Con is that it can be costly and less efficient, particularly for large docs, and there can be retrieval problems depending on where the context in the doc lives. Newer LLMs are better at this. Certain models are better than others. Context stuffing is an appealing approach, certainly for smaller context. When we're talking about larger context, like all the LangGraph docs are around 300,000 tokens, if you add LangChain docs, you're into the millions of tokens, it becomes a bit infeasible to just stuff everything into context for every call to the model. Now, on the other kind of extreme, the idea that's been around for quite a while is indexing. in, for example, something like a vector store. So you take all your docs, let's say we're taking the LangGraph docs of 300,000 tokens, you split them, you embed each split, and you store them in a vector store, and you use some kind of search, like semantic similarity, to retrieve docs that are relevant to your question. Now the pro here is that it's cheap, very scalable, and it's very fast. The con is, and this has been talked about a lot online, it can be tricky to configure this. What's the split size? How many docs to return? And there's also some upfront work to set up and host a vector store. So what I want to talk about here is this idea of using LLM.txt as a reference plus simple tool calling to retrieve URLs based upon a task. So if you think about this, it's really simple and intuitive. LLM.txt just gives an LLM a reference of all the URLs, as well as descriptions. The LLM can look at a task and decide which ones to read, just like a human would. It's like a table of contents. And really all I need to do is just pass the LLM.txt to an LLM and give it some tool that can just directly read URLs. That's really it. Only con is it's some upfront work to set up LLM.txt, but many different libraries are actually building them for you already. And it can be higher latency because you may make multiple tool calls to retrieve different URLs and reflect on them. So really all I want is the ability to define a super simple URL loader tool and apply that to URLs in any LLM.txt I provide, and somehow connect all that to my applications of choice like Cursor, Windsurf, Claude. That's the motivation here. So to solve the last problem, the connection bit, that's where MCP comes in. So we have a separate video on MCP that came out earlier this week, and I'll link in the description here. But it's a very nice and simple way to connect tools to common applications like Cursor, Windsurf, Claude. And here's a schematic of all that's happening. The applications are going to have access to this LLM.txt, and it can reflect on that, make tool calls to read specific URL present in LLM.txt, and the tool just returns the URL contents to your host application, and it can iterate as long as it wants until it's satisfied with the solution. So we have this repo, everything's open source to help you set this up, and we have instructions for setting it up with Cursor, Windsurf, or Claude. Let's just set it up right now. So in a fresh terminal, I'm just going to run this to spin up my MCP server. Now this is optional, and this is just to test that the server is actually working. Now you'll see, I spin this up with a link to the LangGraph LLMs.txt. And so now my MCP server is running. In a separate terminal, I can just kick off Model Context Protocol Inspector, open that, click on the provided link. My MCP server is running here, paste that in. I'm using transport type SSE and connect. I'm connected to the server. I can check what tools exist, list them out. It has a list doc sources tool. Let's run it. And that provides the link I gave. Nice. And I can run the fetch docs tool, pass in a random URL to test, run it. Look at that. We get the doc very quickly. So now we know that our server works. So now I just need to connect the server to my various hosts. So this is Cursor as one host. Go to settings, go to MCP, add new MCP server, and just paste in this. This is provided in the README. And this is just running the same command we just ran. But in this particular case, the host application Cursor is going to run this for us. Spin this up and connect to it. So that's done. Go back to MCP and you'll see it is indeed connected by this green icon. Go to chat, select agent. And now our instructions here make a bit more sense. Call that list doc sources tool to get the available LLM.txt files. Call fetch docs to read it. Call fetch docs and any relevant URLs to answer the question. Now all this you could add to Cursor rules as an example, so you don't have to actually add it into chat, but I'm just putting it all here for most transparency. Ask a question, and we can see it correctly says, okay, let's go ahead and call list docs tool to get any available LLM.txt files. Run the tool. It goes ahead and fetches the concepts.memory doc. It deems that to be most relevant to my question, which is exactly right. We can see the return context here. It also decides to look for a bit more memory implementations, and we can see very nicely exactly the docs it retrieved, what it pulled into context, and now it used that to answer the question in a lot of detail. So in Windsurf, just click Configure MCP, and that takes you to the configuration file. This is exactly what we just did. This is just the Windsurf config and paste it in just like we saw before, and then prompt it just as we did previously. In Claude, go to Settings, go to developer, edit the configuration to add the server configuration as we did previously. And this also works with Claude Code. So all you actually need to do is, if you follow the README, just run this command as noted in the README. In this case, I've already added this particular MCP server, open Claude. It notifies that it finds one MCP server, and we can see LangGraph docs is indeed connected. We can approve the MCP tool calls. Cool. We can see that it's loading pages, and we get a nice answer grounded in our document. So overall, the idea here is pretty simple. LLMs.txt is a very nice way to give LLMs a guide of table of contents for various websites, and many different providers, frameworks, tools, or libraries are adding them. The question is, how do you connect them with your favorite applications like Cursor, Claude, Windsurf? And how do you audit which URLs from LLMs.txt are actually being read and what context is being passed to the LLM? That's exactly what this simple MCP server solves, and I found it to be really useful. Everything's open source, so feel free to give this a try. Leave any comments or questions about usage. I found this to be quite nice for working with LLMs.txt files in various applications like Cursor, Windsurf, and Claude. Thanks.